Kia ora tātou katoa. Today I want to give a brief introduction to Progressive Theology. And sometimes a good starting point is to say what it is not. What, generally speaking, progressive don't believe, or what most who adhere to that label progressive don't believe. So here's a starter. God does not have his home off the planet. God is not a his. Indeed, neither a being, supernatural or not. God is not looking down on us from afar and planning to visit or invade our world by sending emissaries like prophets or armies of angels. Most talk about God in church liturgies, traditional church liturgies, and indeed in public conversation, assume this supernatural understanding of deity. This notion of an off-the-planet superbeing, I suspect, was never meant to be taken literally, but rather was a poetic expression of the ineffable, with some patriarchal presumptions thrown in. In our overly literal world, such expressions have been solidified into dogmas, and as such have fallen into ridicule by the rise of science-based understandings of the cosmos. Certainly, in the Aotearoa New Zealand public discourse, reference to God has largely been paused, thankfully. Diminishing that word further by attaching our prejudices and politics to it doesn't help. Watch an American political campaign, for example, and despair over the use of this G word as it's used to signal positions largely of a conservative bent. I suggest in our 21st century Antipodean context that if we use the God word at all, we should use it playfully, attaching weak as well as strong metaphors to it, gender bending it, upside downing it, spelling it differently, all in order to declare that whatever we say about God is provisional, our best guess, our glimpse, our experience, and certainly not something to bank on or to defend to the death or to clobber another with. And not something we would use to make a law or an ethical standard or something to reinforce the existing powers and prejudices of patriarchy, as the church has often done. As Jack Spong once said, I cannot say who God is, but I can tell you how I believe I experience God, realizing I may be deluded. Similarly, Jesus is not a God-man hybrid from outer space, who after a brief saving sojourn on our planet is now reigning as triumphant monarch over the cosmos. He was rather an itinerant rabbi, teacher, influenced by Diogenes' cynics, who cared about and gave his life for a vision of all manner of people, poor, rich, female, male, Jew, Gentile, outsiders, downtrodden, eating and being together. A subversive, flat structure of giving, compared with the normative, hierarchical structure of getting. An anti-empire vision, where the little and least were honoured, where sharing was the norm and loving kindness the language. After his death, Jesus' movement of subversion lived on in many forms and groups, experimenting with different theology, lifestyles and allegiances, watched suspiciously by the empire. Yet such diversity as time ticked on over those first few centuries slowly dwindled and a conformity arose, a felt need to narrow the breadth, to reassert patriarchy, a need to be creedal, a need for empire's patronage. It's highly likely that a storytelling Jewish drifter who healed without permission and upset the rich wouldn't have been welcomed in this new type of church. And what became by the 300s CE, the Christian church, needed new doctrines to keep the subversive anarchy at the heart of Jesus' vision in line. So along came original sin, and the mythic story of a perfect and finished creation tarnished by human want, a snake and a woman. It is pre-Darwinian mythology and post-Darwinian nonsense. It's also dangerous and has done untold harm. It created a sin, guilt, confession and penance industry that came to define Christianity as a religion of rules, as prizing above all obedience, and making the damaged believe that the damage was their fault. It's all about behavior control, leading to fears about what would happen after death, manipulating fears about what would happen after death. And original sin continues to work its destructiveness even today. As Lloyd Gearing has shown, everything the old doctrines were sure about, the world, the human psyche, the way societies work, have been superseded by developments in various fields of human knowledge. Yet the church in many places clings to the old doctrines. Bad ideas have staying power. And along came the doctrine of the virgin birth. Allegedly, a heavenly fertilized egg was planted in Mary's womb, initiating the visitation of the divine Jesus to earth. Such mythical obstetrics was common in the ancient world. There were many notables allegedly with divine origins. But like original sin, this dogma was used to oppress women, encouraging compliance and impossible expectations. Both these doctrines coalesce in atonement theology, especially in its most bizarre substitutionary form, which presents us with a God who is barbaric, a Jesus who is a victim, hanging there on the cross on our behalf. Supposedly it was our sin and Jesus' divine sinlessness that would lead to a death pact where Jesus would be our substitute and die for our sins. As Spong said, what kind of God needs his son to die on a cross before that God will think about forgiving people? Atonement theology also undercuts ethics and morality. How we live is supposedly not nearly as important, according to this atonement thinking, as how Jesus died. But this theology is also dangerous in weakening the foundations of human responsibility for right living. Human responsibility, rather than abdicating in favor of ancient moral codes or church dogma, is central to progressive thinking, whether the issue be the future of the planet or justice for queer communities. As with Jesus' death, so too his resurrection was reimagined by a church increasingly in step with the values of empire. Mythic stories were literalized. Resurrection as something the believer experiences, and in a transformation with community consequences, became something that literally happened to Jesus' dead body. It was resuscitated. And instead of resurrection being a myth about empowerment for all in the ongoing Jesus movement, Jesus' ongoing power was shared with an elite group of men, and then removed with him off the planet, what's called the ascension, where it would be dispensed selectively. The biblical story of ascension, of course, assumes a three-tiered universe, which was debunked some 500 years ago. We don't believe that God resides in the top tier and hell's at the bottom and earth's some sort of floppy disk between. It's just ancient mythology that hopefully fewer and fewer people take literally. So these doctrines about sin and Jesus' birth, death, resurrection and ascension were worked and reworked over the first millennia and through the great councils of the church. Belief and assent to belief, in other words obedience, became more important than compassionate behavior. Creeds and dogma and those who created and maintained them became more important than the storytellers and those who sat non-judgmentally alongside the poor. Justice became something the empire and its descendants determined and the church largely supported, rather than something that shook the foundations of the empire and all its hierarchies in the name of a drifter's egalitarian vision. Progressive theology looks at these old doctrines, asks questions about where they're from and who profits from their ideas, and then tries to playfully reimagine what God, morality, and us in community might look like in the reflection of that drifter's vision. Old ideas, like an inerrant Bible to be obeyed rather than discussed, are put on the shelf as we together work out how to live and practice that vision today. Progressive theology is also open to the wisdom from other religious and spiritual traditions. The idea that Christianity has a monopoly on the truth about God not only denies our Jewish roots, but feeds the discrimination and racism that religion can foster. Yet at the same time, when progressives enter into an interfaith dialogue, where they not only bring the essentials of hospitality and deep listening, compassionate heart, they also bring a healthy skepticism about myths and doctrines, about who profits from them, and what the least might be getting out of it, if anything. Prayer, too, is reimagined in the light of all this. Gone is the notion of praying in order to get the deity on side. That deity has died. Instead, prayer is about community, solidarity, and commitment to being alongside each other, to make justice, to make compassion, to make change. We hold each other psychically, and together we work. It's in the making, holding and working together that a new way of knowing God is experienced. Then, with all that I've said, there is a proviso, a joker card, if you like. Namely, love trumps it all. Compassion beats beliefs. Reimagine, if you will, for a minute, the story of the Good Samaritan, where the beaten man in the ditch is a drag queen. We're often beaten. The Levite who walks by is a well-known social justice lawyer. And the priest who does likewise is the minister of St. Luke's Remuera. And reimagine the Samaritan as a leader in a Bible-believing, hands-in-the-air, conservative evangelical denomination. On that day, he's the one who stops and helps. On that day when actions count, the social justice lawyer and the St. Luke's minister who too busy or think that someone else needs to stop or whatever. On that day when Jesus is describing what a neighbor is, it is that man with the wacky and frankly terrible beliefs who fits the bill. Not because of what he believes, but because of what he does. Likewise, in the end, on that day of need, it's what we do that counts. And this is at the heart of progressive thought and practice. Have a great week.